Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 4.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for taking the time to spend a little bit of time with us here. We're going to be covering AWS and Deloitte, streamlining Active Directory migration with AWS managed Microsoft AD Hybrid Edition. My name is Rodney Undercuffler. I'm a specialist solutions architect at AWS. I've been working with Active Directory for more than 25 years now at this point. It sounds much longer when I say it out loud there, but yeah, over 25 years. Nearly every day I'm having conversations with customers around Active Directory. So whether it's implementing, migrating, or optimizing on AWS. And I'm joined by my colleague from Deloitte.
Yeah, my name is Alex Gunther. I work in our digital controls audit and assurance practice, so anything around automating away your risk and controls from manual processes into, typically with AWS, a lot of cloud native services to, just in the spirit of continuous compliance, right? That's sort of what our bread and butter is. So just to introduce a little more about sort of why Deloitte is here. Deloitte and AWS, we have a long-standing relationship and a partnership. Obviously, we work together to sell to go to market. For the hybrid edition of AD that we're talking about today, myself and a team from audit and assurance and a team from our cyber practice performed an extensive beta test or pre-evaluation of the service. So we'll just be talking a little bit more about what we learned, what we saw, and sort of how we see it impacting our customers, our clients, and AWS customers in the future.
Yeah, and in the next 20 minutes, we're going to be covering what you see up here. So Active Directory migration pathways, the different methods and means that you have to integrate Active Directory with AWS. We'll dive into some of the challenges around the different implementations and ultimately how the evolution of identity with Active Directory has evolved over those 25 years and the different challenges that have been solved with our AWS solutions and ultimately Hybrid Edition. We'll be covering how we were involved with Deloitte during our lengthy partnership around Hybrid Active Directory, a little bit about the beta test that we did with them, and then some of the Hybrid AD benefits, so the solution that Hybrid AD is bringing to those challenges. And then we'll touch briefly on the Hybrid AD architecture as well. So first off, we have 3 general paths that customers typically take when it comes to migrating or just integrating Active Directory with AWS. So the first one is the AD connector. Now you can think of the AD connector as like a proxy service for your Active Directory to AWS native services. So that means that you don't need to deploy any hardware, you don't have to move your domain controllers. It's merely taking an AWS native service and proxying that authentication for you to your Active Directory DCs, whether they're on premises or if they're virtualized within AWS. It's just a network path using a service account to the AD connector. So it's usually a first step. It's used very often in a POC or if you have just a limited service engagement that you need to do with your Active Directory. But ultimately, the recommendation there is to use EC2, right? So you're going to extend in on EC2 as a first step. So you're not dependent then on the connectivity back to your on-premises environment. All the authentication is happening within AWS, right? But then you still have all the management that comes along with that as well, right? So it's just the same way that you're operating your Active Directory on-premises, you're operating it now on the cloud, on EC2, gives you all that control that you need. But what it doesn't give you is that integration with AWS native services. You still need to use either the AD connector or the AWS managed Microsoft AD to integrate with those native services. Now, you don't have to do like one of these. Very often customers will have all 3. They may have EC2 extended in, they may be using AD connector for some specific use case, and then they're using managed Microsoft AD to integrate in a more broad fashion with our managed services. So you can think of managed Microsoft AD just as Active Directory, but with all the power of the cloud, right? We're doing all the operational heavy lifting, we're doing the patching, the management, the maintenance, and then you're able to utilize the Active Directory functionality on top of that. Now it's a single or separate forest, separate domain, so you're going to set up the trusts and have that authentication coming back, or you can go ahead and create your users, your groups, and such on managed Active Directory. So let's take a look at the evolution of identity management in regards to Active Directory just over time. So like I said, it's been 25 years now. Active Directory's been out. Almost every company still has some footprint of Active Directory out there. Very often, it's the authoritative source for their workforce identities. Right? But it really solved a problem for us around centralizing that authentication. Right? It gave us the means to do that in a multi-master model, so you can make changes on any domain controller. They're going to replicate around. It gave us the ability to do group policy, so now we can standardize policy enforcement across your organization. So it did a lot of good things 25 years ago and still does today. But we still face a few problems, right? So there is no cloud integration. Remember how I mentioned, like when you run EC2 and you're running domain controllers, you don't get that cloud integration without some other service involved. Whether that's adding SAML authentication, so ADFS or some other identity provider, you need to add something to it in order to get at least some level of cloud integration. You have the hardware refreshes that you have to continue to do. You have manual disaster recovery changes, whether that's transferring or seizing FSMA roles, DR testing and such. And then you have the physical boundaries, right? So the domain controllers are available where they are, whether it's the data center or within your offices or over VPNs, that type of a thing. We have the extension of self-managed AD on EC2. So that solved some of the problems, got rid of the hardware refreshes that you had to worry about, but you still have many of the same challenges that you faced on premises, you face them on EC2, right? Because you're still doing the patching, you're still doing backups yourself, you're still doing other maintenance and operations on the EC2. I mean, you can script them just like you would on premises, but it's the same heavy lift that you're doing on premises, you're still doing that on EC2. And then we have, and I believe yesterday was the 10-year anniversary of Managed Active Directory on AWS. So this isn't a new service. It's matured over time, very reliable. But this gives you the ability now to integrate via a trust with multiple domains, multiple forests, and integrate those domains with our AWS services. So you can do things like RDS integration, FSX, workspaces, and many other integrations. We're taking care of the disaster recovery part of it, the backups, the patching. And it's available for you to see within the console, so you can get SNS notifications when there's an impairment, and we're replacing domain controllers and such. But you're still faced with a few challenges, right? So even though it's 10 years old, it solved a lot of the challenges of the past. You still have trust management. You still have to maintain that separate forest, separate domain. So there's a little bit of complexity there. So let's double click on the challenges that we face yet with managed AD and your workforce identities. Let's look at it from the perspective of migration. So when you're going to migrate, and over the years I've done many of these migrations, there's a lot of planning involved, probably even more so than the time it takes to migrate, right? Just because you have the complexity of moving those identities, re-permissioning, and doing so in a manner that you're not affecting users, right? You want to keep the systems up and have the authentication functioning throughout the migration. Right? And I mentioned preserving access. So once you migrate, and let's say you're migrating to our Managed Active Directory, you're going to have to re-permission because it's a separate forest, separate domain, right? So you're not preserving that AD forest name. And if you wanted to do that, you'd have to use like a third-party tool, like Active Directory migration tools or a vendor product. And many of these tools require you to have a trust in place. So you can't have the same forest, same domain name on both sides. You end up doing a double hop. So that just doubles the complexity of the migration. So because of these challenges, and these are all challenges that we hear from customers all the time over the years, we took all the feedback and we created Hybrid Edition for Managed Active Directory. This was released back in August. So we were able to release it based on the existing Managed Active Directory that we have out there today. So it's using many of the same functionality, a lot of the same automation, a lot of the same just mature services and applications that we already have in place for the existing service. So this is going to allow you to now, instead of doing a migration, you're going to go ahead and just extend in. So there is no more worrying about like SID history or re-permissioning. You're using the same users, the same groups, the same SIDs, so you're not losing or changing any access when you're extending in on Hybrid Edition. Trusts. You don't need to set up trusts anymore, right? Because it's the same domain, same forest, so there's no management of setting up a one-way or a two-way trust. Again, you're just using the same authentication that you're using today on your existing self-managed Active Directory. So you can think of it as Active Directory domain controllers, but then supercharged with AWS operations, right? So we're taking over the heavy lifting. You still maintain the control of your self-managed side. We're taking care of all of the management of the domain controllers that are part of your hybrid edition instance. And then you can also look at it from the aspect of scalability, right? And so when we talk about scalability, it's two different, you can think of it in two different perspectives, right? The first one being, you can scale out those 2 domain controllers for hybrid edition to 3, to 4, to 5, however many you need. You can do that through the console with the click of a button, or you can automate it. We have blogs and workshops out there that explain how to do this in an automated fashion. So once the load gets to a certain point and you're looking at the metrics, you can extend that out as needed, scale it back in. Something that you weren't able to do, especially easily, on physical hardware in your own data centers. The second aspect of that scalability comes with account access. So you can take that hybrid edition and then share that with 10, 100, however many accounts you have out there to share that directory. And when I say share, you're not extending any additional hardware. There's no additional hybrid edition instances that get deployed. All you're doing is making that hybrid edition instance available to all of your accounts as needed. So why Deloitte? Well, we've been working with Deloitte, and we had a beta that was, I believe, 9 months or so prior to the launch. We had this beta, and Deloitte has been a long-standing partner of ours, and they were able to help us not only with insight with their internal use of the beta, but from just their experience and access to other customers.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Rodney. And yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here. This has been a great experience, just sort of getting myself to reinvent, to meet so many different people, to learn about what it's like to be here. So thank you to AWS. But yeah, so why Deloitte? Why were we here? I think from our perspective and our relationship with AWS, right, we as a multi-practice, multi-industry consulting advisory partner have the ability to sort of see these new technologies, see these new products, the direction things are going, and sort of evaluate them in a way that will help us to best serve our clients, best serve AWS customers. So one thing that we are totally aware of now is just driven by the maturity and the evolution of identity and cloud identities providers and Entra ID, and is the fact that a lot less technology elements in a typical enterprise need to directly connect to Active Directory, right? So what that means is where before, once cloud was being adopted more and more, and you wanted to sort of preserve your authentication, your identities, now that we have the ability to sort of remove those direct connections, we can start to actually decrease the footprint of an Active Directory infrastructure that is managed by any typical enterprise, right? So essentially what we're seeing in that sense is what we're calling like AD minimalization, right? So it's just very straightforward, right? It's just a strategic reduction in your footprint, right? So how do we sort of make sure that we are only connecting things to our directory that needs to be there? How are we minimizing our overhead, right? All of that good stuff. So that was a major lens of which we approached this beta program. In addition to a few others, I think I mentioned, I mentioned before our alliance, right? So when we're talking about our alliance with AWS, it's as we talked about, how do we best serve our customers? How do we best stay on top of the trends, right? So like identity modernization, cloud migration strategy, these are things that we have to be on top of to best do those, to achieve those objectives, right? So another lens would be, for my personal offering within digital controls, is the impact that these new services would have to an organization's control framework, right? Because risk and controls are often an afterthought with cloud migrations, right? And once you get everything set up and you're ready to go live, you realize, okay, wait, now I have all these compliance requirements that are going to be impacted by me expanding my infrastructure, right? So things like your attack surface, your cloud controls, right? How are you managing identity and access management, provisioning, deprovisioning, your network controls? If you have to like Rodney mentioned, with the managed AD service, when you had to expand with 2 trusts, you're going to have additional network controls, monitoring over the identity synchronizations, things like that. And the last lens here was just as technical validation, right? Opening the service, trying it out, right? We've heard all these cool features, these cool things, but AWS really wanted our feedback on what it was like, right? What was it like using it as not only as a customer, but also as like a strategic advisor to our clients, right? So in that sense, we're talking about, okay, are the permissions working? Or is the domain being extended in a simplified way? Like, what is the administration for us as a beta tester or as an AWS customer? Are we able to maintain our security boundary? Are we able to maintain our control framework? And our key takeaways were just that, right? So when we talk about AD minimalization as a trend, this is the culmination of that. You know, at least from our experience, my team's experience working on the beta test, because I'm not a domain administrator, right? I'm a consultant at Deloitte, but within a week, right, of starting this, kicking off this project, setting up an entire mock directory that was, representative of a client environment, within a couple days, we're able to launch this new hybrid service, right, with our mock directory, which was great. So obviously there's huge potential there for migration velocity, speed, and it really does authentically meet that AD minimalization trend. From a risk and control perspective, right, you're diversifying your platforms, right? You're minimizing the extra trust and the maintenance over like trust and force relationship. So say you have a DR event or some type of incident that impacts your connectivity, right, between your trusts, that is eliminated with hybrid AD, right? Because like I said, you don't need to set up those additional trusts. It's all automatic, right? It's just click and go. And I know Rodney will talk a little bit more about the RDS integration. I think we mentioned briefly, but prior to hybrid, you had to set up these additional forests. You have to synchronize your identities, and you have to continue to do these permission mappings for each individual aspect of your databases. But yeah, long story short, the takeaways are exactly what we've been talking about here. So in thinking about how our experience with this service can impact our customers, right? What are the potential use cases? What are the things that our clients, what are the challenges or requirements that they're facing that they could benefit from, right? And we just, thought through some of that and listed some of these here. I know we'll talk a little bit about sort of the timeline, the mergers and acquisitions, right? If I need to bring somebody into my environment in a fast, efficient way with minimal effort, right? Can I preserve all my existing access controls? Can I meet my leadership's objectives for multi-account strategies or expansion or any type of transformation to sort of start to distribute your AWS environment? And yeah, I think we wanted to just call out a few comparisons here, and if we can pull up the table, from my perspective, again, is from a risk and controls background, right? The biggest takeaway is that it's minimal overhead for a security team to be able to just extend their directory using hybrid, right? So where if you're, like we've mentioned before, synchronizing identities, you have to monitor that. You have to make sure that provisioning and deprovisioning are working automatically, that the authorizations are actually being passed in a way that keeps those in sync, right? You don't need to launch additional infrastructure. You don't need to enhance your network controls in a way that sort of monitors the new infrastructure that you've set up. So, and I think we want to talk a little bit about the speed and velocity and things like that. But yeah, at a high level, the beta test was a huge success. Had a great experience doing it. I know Rodney will speak a little bit more on the timeline.
Yeah, and because of all that, it's really an accelerator. You can see it takes it from months, a migration typically would take months and months, especially in a complex environment. But we're talking about 2 to 4 weeks, and that's including testing, because you're just extending in using your existing one. There's no re-permissioning, that type of a thing. And I think most importantly, after all, it's so fast, but you can make these fast decisions because it's a two-way door, right? It's a controlled rollback where you can just deprovision, clean up AD, and you can move back and forth if you needed to, right? So it's not a one-way door decision. It's not a complex migration. It's really, and because of all that, it's just an accelerator for your implementation. And I can think of one in particular, the RDS example. That's a huge one for our customers. So a lot of customers will do like local logons for RDS until they realize, hey, it's all manual work. You have to deprovision. They leave access that shouldn't be there. So the integration with RDS, with Managed Active Directory, just becomes a lot simpler because of this.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. I want to leave you with a few resources here. So we have Deloitte's guide on managed cloud security. We also have the hybrid launch blog that's here in the middle, and then the documentation link on the right. And thank you very much for your time. We'll be off to the side. If you have additional questions, happy to have a conversation.